Imagine, my friends, that you were a doctor, that you were, for example, a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, and that you were looking at some CT scans. And when you looked at these CT scans, you came to the conclusion that the person who scans these were most likely had stage 4 cancer. And imagine that the neurologist, the neurosurgeon who's looking at these scans, then thinks about the fact that these scans are of his own brain. Or imagine a scenario where you had been told that you had only 6 months to live. I suppose we've all imagined that scenario many times in our lives. I think one of the most moving expressions of that scenario that I first encountered was in Akira Kurosawa's majestic film, Ikiru, where an ordinary office worker in Japan one day finds out that he's only 6 months to live. And how does he spend those remaining 6 months? It's immaterial that very often a person is given a diagnosis and then they live much longer, or sometimes they live for a shorter period of time. My father, for example, was given a diagnosis of lung cancer in 2011, and I was there when he was given that diagnosis because I'm the one who had taken him to the hospital. This is in New Delhi, and then he was told that, or I was told rather, because he was on a hospital bed, that he had pericardial effusion, carcinoma. And I said, what is that exactly? I knew what carcinoma meant. But anyhow, the long and short is they told me that he had stage 4 lung cancer. And I asked, well, how long does he have? And the cardiologist present there said, well, I think perhaps 4 to 8 weeks. My father went on to live for 3 months. So imagine you had those 6 months, and what happened in that film Ikiru, where this office worker then devotes himself to trying to build a playground for children in a neighborhood where he knew it was really required, right? Or imagine that you have, how should I put it this way? Imagine to yourself the various ways in which doctors can be more empathetic. I think one of the things that one often encounters in everyday conversation, when the conversation is about doctors' visits to hospitals and so on, is the feeling that doctors don't often have enough empathy for their patients, and particularly in modern systems of medicine, where doctors are always rushed. Uh, in India, especially, we have seen doctors who might see dozens of patients a day, dozens of patients a day. I mean, just walk into a state hospital, Safdarjung Hospital in Delhi, or the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, more popularly known as AIMS, and there are thousands of patients. And you're sitting talking with a doctor, and there are five other people trying to get into the room at the same time, all with queries, right? So if you imagine any of these scenarios, and if you've thought even for a moment about how doctors look after themselves, then the book for you to read is this book called When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. This book was published in 2016 by Bodley Head, uh, an imprint of Vintage Books, which is another imprint of Penguin Books. The book was published in 2016. It was preceded a year and a half ago, I think about a year and a half ago, by a very famous, or what became a very famous piece by the same author, Paul Kalanithi, uh, a piece that he wrote in the New York Times, an opinion piece. And this um, piece was called How Long Have I Got Left? And to use that cliched word, it became viral. And then Paul decided that he would write a book, which is this book that he wrote before he passed on in 2015. He was 37 or 38 years old. And we can think of Paul, before I get onto his career very briefly and then talk a little bit about the book. Um, we can think of Paul as one of a quartet of four Indian doctors of considerable repute in the West, who also are known widely for their writings in the United States, known widely for their writings. So that quartet is comprised of Paul Kalanithi, Abraham Verghese, an Indian doctor who grew up in Ethiopia as well, and has worked in the American South. In fact, Abraham Verghese writes the foreword to this book, and he writes the foreword to this book because, as he says, he had a meeting very briefly with Paul, who wanted to meet with him when his piece had gone viral, and see how he could actually turn it, so to speak, into a book. And Abraham Verghese says in his foreword that he really only got to know Paul after Paul passed on, after he died, right? Uh, so there's Paul Verghese, Abraham Verghese, there's Paul Kalanithi, there's Siddharth Mukherjee, well known as the author of The Emperor of Maladies, a long history, discursive narrative history exploration of cancer. He's also written a book on the gene. And the fourth writer, of course, is Atul Gawande, who's has written often for The New Yorker, and among other things, he wrote a book which is called The Checklist. Um, so, so Paul belongs in that very distinguished company, although he died at the age, as I said, of 37 or 38, very young. So he earned a BA in human biology. This was from uh, Stanford University, and then he went on to earn an MA in English literature. Uh, uh, I think he also had a minor or perhaps a double major in English literature as well, a bachelor's in that as well, but he went on to earn a master's in English literature from Stanford University, and then he went on to University of Cambridge, where he acquired an MPhil in history and philosophy of science and medicine, and then eventually earned an MD from the Yale School of Medicine, where he was inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha National Medical Honor Society. He says in this book, and that seems to be the case, that when he completed his 10 years of training, and it was really when he just finished his training and was about to launch himself into public life, so to speak, right? He says that at the completion of his 10 years of training, he had offers from almost all the leading institutions in this country, that that every university, every medical school, every hospital would have given an arm and a leg to get him on their roster. He was that good. He seems to have been that good in any case. Uh, but none of this was really to happen. So this book begins with Paul looking at a set of CT scans and determining that this person whose scans he's looking at unquestionably has cancer, and these are his own scans that he's looking at, right? And what this book is about is it's about the last year of his life. You could say that that's what the book is about. The book is also about, if I may put it this way, about uh, his reflections on uh, what life means, the various ways in which dying is a part of life. I myself, in fact, only read the book uh, last month, completed it last month. I started it in April in a hospital room. I was sitting beside my mother, who had been on a hospital bed, and I was keeping a watch on her. And it's at that time that I started reading this book by Paul Kalanithi. And so many of his reflections on living, on dying, all of these resonated with me even more so than they might have on any other occasion. So Paul grew up in New York initially. Uh, his parents were South Indian. His father was a Christian. His mother was a Hindu. And his father then decided to move the entire family when he was but 14 years old to a small town in Arizona where Paul went to school, where he finished high school. And and he says that, that seemed like a very odd decision for many reasons that but his father took that decision uh, for many reasons. Uh, he wanted to establish a cardiology. His father was a doctor, wanted to establish a cardiology practice of his own, thought that he could do so more interestingly and more successfully, perhaps in a rural area. He was dedicated to serving his patients. It seems that Paul imbibed much of that spirit from his own father, and his father was not present very much because his father worked exceedingly late hours, became a highly respected member of the community. But then he says that his mother was driven too. She was a highly educated person as well. And his mother was determined that she was going to transform the school system in Klingman, which was among the worst in the country, to a respectable, if not one of the best school systems in the country. Right? And so Paul came clearly from a family that was highly motivated, where he was inspired both the figure of his father uh, and his mother. And there are some charming pages about his years in Klingman with his siblings as well. But let us get on to some of the more interesting aspects of the book. This will not be a very long book at all because I think the book is really, in some ways, as I said, um, really a set of reflections on how one thinks about life. It's also about the practice of medicine, about how he was called upon to assist in surgeries and do surgeries, the difficulties that he encountered as he became more and more sick, his determination to get up from the bed, to go, um, um, to the hospital, aid in these surgeries, perform them, that he was often called upon to do some of the most difficult surgeries. And many of the things that he describes are those swings where a patient who has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, um, and perhaps even an earlier stage, but certainly stage 4 lung cancer, um, sometimes feels extremely pessimistic. You think that you don't have any more time left, and then suddenly, the drug that you've been given, he mentions that he was given Tarkeva, which is the same drug that was given to my father. So, certainly, and recall that Paul died in 2015. My father passed on in 2014. So it was a drug that certainly at that time was viewed as a drug of frontline attack upon lung cancer. Um, and this Tarkeva appeared to have worked because the oncologist under whose care he could have well put himself under his own care, but he decided, professionally speaking, that he would have to that he would have to really think about this in a professional way and put himself in the hands of an oncologist, and accept her advice. He himself was a neurologist, but he had considerable knowledge of course, the basics of medicine. Um, and he says that, for a time, the scans seemed to show that the spread of the cancer had been arrested, so he felt hopeful. But then there were days when he had absolutely no energy left, um, and he questioned in his own mind whether he would ever be able to do surgery again. Right? So, so this is how one can think about the book. But as I said, this is not just a common narrative history, because of a person's last year of his life. He's a gifted writer. There's no question about that. He's a person who was well versed in literature. There are references to T.S. Eliot. Uh, One of the things that Abraham Verghese seems to have shared with him. That might have been a small reason why perhaps he decided that he would contribute to the foreword to this book. One of the things that he seems to have shared with Paul Kalanithi is a love for this book called Religio Medici, which is a book from the the medieval period, a book written by Thomas Browne in 1642. It was a book deeply loved by William uh, Osler. Um, William Osler is a physician whose name I encountered um, well over 40 years ago, because he was a physician, as I seem to recall, at Johns Hopkins University, and one of the figures who's principally responsible for the emergence of modern medicine in the United States. And Osler loved this book. He kept it by his bedside. So William Osler, Abraham Verghese, Paul Kalanithi, they all loved this book by Thomas Browne, Religio Medici, written in 1642. And you'll find references to this, to at least one of the references to this book on page 53 of Paul's book, where he is in turn recalling another physician, a very famous physician by the name of Shep Newland, who was at the Yale School of Medicine and who had written a book about mortality called How We Die. And Newland had, in fact, also cited at a particular moment, right? um, Particular moment, this book uh, by Browne. And here's a quotation from Thomas Browne's 1642 book: "With what strife and pains we come into the world, we know not, but it is commonly no easy matter to get out of it." So, um, uh, uh, when breath becomes air, uh, is really like a fresh breath of air. And it's a book that one can skim through. One can read it rapidly in a few hours. There are many other interesting aspects of it. The book is also about how to have empathy as a doctor. And one of the things that Paul felt that he had to do was to always try to cultivate a certain kind of empathy for his patients. There are moments when he expresses revulsion at those doctors who um, are incapable of doing it, or who he thinks have in some ways betrayed the profession itself when they don't have empathy for their patients. But there also, of course, some of it is, some of the book deploys the kind of metaphors that one is familiar with. So if you consider, for example, this passage which begins um, um, at the bottom of page 81 on the last line, drowning, he says, even in blood, one adapts, learns to float, to swim, even to enjoy life, bonding with the nurses, doctors, and others who are clinging to the same raft, caught in the same tide, right? The lifeboat metaphor. How do we keep that lifeboat, uh, uh, moving on, so to speak, in the midst of these storms that come and threaten to overthrow it, right? Um, he describes his residency, the fellowship, the 10 years of his training as a neurosurgeon. Um, and I do recommend this book very much. I will only conclude here with uh, a set of observations that he makes on page 80, moving into page 81, uh, to indicate where I think uh, the reader who is somewhat observant can pause and say, do I really agree with everything that Paul Kalanithi is saying, right? So this is what he says: as my skills increased, so too did my responsibility. Page 80, learning to judge whose lives could be saved, whose couldn't be, and whose shouldn't be requires an unattainable prognostic ability. And of course, there's some sense of discomfort that the reader might have, because when he says learning to judge whose lives could be saved, all right, so a patient comes in, and this patient has had a terrible accident, and the doctor comes quickly at a decision that, well, we really can be saved. Okay, this is a life that can be saved. Whose lives couldn't be. The doctor comes to an awareness, perhaps after having made an attempt, that this person cannot be salvaged, their life cannot be salvaged. But how about whose lives shouldn't be? Now, what exactly does it mean by that? Is that a form of triage? That there are, so which is what happened in COVID, that if there were dozens of people who were brought in to a hospital with extremely limited facilities with just a few beds, well, who did you decide you were going to save? Was it going to be the older person? Was it going to be the younger person? There could be many other criteria. This was unquestionably in many ways, the principal criteria. If a person is coming in and is 85 years old, they most likely have other compromised systems as well, and they most likely don't have many more years ahead of them. So if one person has to be sacrificed, it's the older person, right? But then is the doctor playing God, right? Right? And is Paul Kalanithi doing that? Then he says, I made mistakes, rushing a patient to the OR, operating room, to save only enough brain that his heart beats, but he can never speak. He eats through a tube, and he is condemned to an existence he would never want. I came to see this as a more egregious failure than the patient dying. That, if a person has no future ahead of them, really, that you can be absolutely certain that they would not have desired this existence, maybe that's a life that should not be. And this is where of course, one begins to recognize that this is something that happens in everyday life, and it can happen to one's own parents. It can happen to people one knows around oneself, right? The twilight existence of an unconscious metabolism becomes an unbearable burden. And this is what I meant when I said he is a gifted writer. The twilight existence of unconscious metabolism becomes an unbearable burden, usually left to an institution where the family, unable to attain closure, visits with increasing rarity until the inevitable fatal bedsore or pneumonia sets in. Some insist on this life and embrace its possibility eyes open, but many do not or cannot, and the neurosurgeon must learn to adjudicate. I think he may be giving a little too much credence to the almighty position of the neurosurgeon. But notwithstanding all of that, there's but no question that this book is a book that is worthy of at least a very quick read, and a book that I think does touch upon some pivotal questions of living and dying.